Hi, my name's Matt Yoon, and I am here today to talk about 3 ways that microparasites... Microparasites? What are those? They're viruses, bacteria, or multi-celled small little creatures. Back to the presentation. 3 ways that microparasites wants you dead or alive. Now, most of us here are in college. I'm told one of the most favorite things that college students love to do is to go out and blow off some steam. And what better place you can do that than at a club? So let's say that you're at the club and you see this one hot, wasted girl, and you say, "That's tight," which is why you saunter over, and long story short, you end up hooking up with her that night. And what you didn't realize that while you weren't using protection that night was that she was in fact infected with the common rhinovirus. You didn't actually think I was going to say STD, right? Within a couple of hours, your body starts showing off the signs, fighting off the foreign microbe in the form of a fever. This is an example of a microparasite that causes your body to elicit an immune response. Sometimes your body is able to fight off these foreign invaders with a natural immune response in the form of white blood cells and a fever, which allows you to survive. Pretty good, right? I noticed just by the way that you're listening to my voice today that all of you are extremely beautiful. So beautiful that I'm willing to hazard a guess that you all must have kissed multiple girls or guys when you're in high school. As a matter of fact, you probably kissed so many people that you ended up getting mononucleosis or mono. Let's get back to the Clizub for another example. Remember that Jaeger bomb that you've been drinking all night long? Well, you decided to give your friends a sip because they wanted to taste of your Jaeger bomb. Well, within a few days, your friend complains of being tired and sleepy. The reason why, you ask? Well, it's actually because of you. What? You ended up transferring a microparasite in the form of a virus called the Epstein-Barr virus that doesn't hurt you anymore, but hurts your friend. Okay! Fancy. Essentially, you've managed to show the second thing a microparasite can do to you, which is use you as a carrier. So let's get back to the third type of reaction that your body has to microparasites. For one last time, let's go visit the club again. Remember that one hot, wasted girl that you were fancying from the first example? Fooling with you, she actually had HIV. Within a couple of months, you start feeling tired and feverish, which are symptoms of an HIV infection. Because you're a poor college student, you're not able to afford the HIV treatments, and you end up dying. This is an example of a microparasite in the form of a virus that causes your body to elicit an immune response, but you aren't able to fight off the virus, and you end up succumbing to the virus. But don't be sad, at least you died happy. In review, we've gone over microparasites that can kill you, use you as a carrier, or your body is able to fight off the microparasite. Are there any occasions that you can think of that microparasites can actually help you?
Hi everyone, I'm Christina Hill. In this HISPM 711 Power of 3 video, I'm going to be discussing orthogenic spurts as described by William McNeill in Plagues in Peoples. I will explain what orthogenic spurts are and discuss their significance for the early development of some of mankind's most important traits. I'll also explain how orthogenic spurts fit into today's class topic, which explores the social and natural environment's impact on disease in early history. Let's get started. The word orthogenic, as used today, refers to a corrective procedure of some kind that is designed to promote healthy development. We generally think of the term spurt as rapid progress, like when a kid suddenly seems to grow a foot taller in the span of a couple of months. An orthogenic spurt is just what it sounds like, a change that promotes healthy development relatively rapidly or over a relatively short period of time. Generally speaking, evolutionary theory proposes that developmental changes occur slowly through natural selection. We're talking millions of years to develop a single trait. However, some genetic traits are game changers. When humans took advantage of these traits, they enlarged their food supply and increased their chances for survival by such wide margins that these traits culminated much more rapidly than usual in the evolutionary progress of the species. That's why these flurries of evolutionary development are known as spurts. Like a kid going through a growth spurt, the developments are moving much more rapidly than normal. Orthogenesis was one of the most prominent hypotheses of species development in the 19th century. Proponents claim that special traits evolved in a unilinear fashion toward an ultimate goal, rather than according to survival value as natural selection proposed. Although nonlinear and complex paleontological patterns emerging in the fossil record largely debunked this theory soon after its advent, the term orthogenic is still used today to describe certain evolutionary developments that may occur in a linear fashion to reinforce a beneficial characteristic. An orthogenic spurt is therefore the result of natural developments of these characteristics in our pre-human ancestors that greatly enhance the ability of the species to survive. For example, the development of certain skills in weaponry made hunting big game and fighting other groups of humanoids possible. Likewise, certain transformations to the brain, tongue, and throat allowed verbal communication and language to develop. Orthogenic spurts were important for a number of reasons. The accumulation of beneficial traits over a shorter period gave groups of humanoids a fighting chance as they competed against disease, war with each other, and starvation for survival. In fact, it soon upset the balance of power, tipping the scales in favor of man over nature as groups of hunters became more skilled with the development of communication skills and language. The effective hunting of big game massively increased food source. McNeill says that the development of language made hunters fully human for the first time. It allowed them to have a greater measure of control over their surroundings as they gained new skills and learned behaviors became traditions to pass down through the generations. In short, orthogenic spurts reflected the rapid accumulation of the traits that humans needed to survive and thrive in their natural environment and to interact in their social environment. I'm going to close with a couple of discussion questions. What do you think was more important to the survival and development of mankind during the time period we're discussing today, hunting skills or the development of language? Why? And do you think that the impacts that these orthogenic spurts had on humans with regard to susceptibility and exposure to disease were more positive or negative overall? Thanks for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed the discussion in class today.
Hi, my name is Gloria Soememe, and this is my Power of 3 video. I'll be talking about the grand invention of clothes. Today, there's hardly anyone who steps out of their homes without putting on some pieces of clothing. It would be completely abnormal to see an individual walking on the streets without having clothes on. This was not the case some 1,000 years ago. The human race has gone through a series of evolutionary processes, and the grand invention of clothes is one of such orthogenesis. The innate ability of man to survive and dominate in his environment was at the heart of the invention of clothing. Man killed wild animals and used their furs and skins as clothing to keep warm. However, over the years, the purpose and style of clothing has gone beyond just keeping warm. With the invention of this modern behavior of man, people have made fortunes from designing clothes and selling them. The first person who invented clothing will probably be shocked that there are singular pieces of clothing item that cost more than an annual minimum income. Not only does clothing have economic importance, it can be used as a form of identification of your origin, social status, and even sometimes your profession. If I see a man in a white coat with a stethoscope on his neck, I wouldn't hesitate to call him a physician. Apart from the economic and identification implication of clothing, the way you dress can define your social status. If a man is dressed in a three-piece suit, he's seen as a gentleman. But that same man is seen as a thug if he's dressed in baggy sweatpants falling below his waistline with a huge silver jewelry and no shirt on. Clothing has brought warmth. No doubt, clothing has brought warmth, financial income, and a source of identification to man. But with it, we have created walls where our true souls and personalities is camouflaged by our outer clothing. What if we were all still naked? Not naked in a literal sense, but naked and transparent in our thoughts, motives, and actions towards each other. I can't help but wonder how life would be if we were all still naked. Would the religious, racial, and political walls prevalent in our world today exist if man remained transparent? If the human race was still naked, our actions would be transparent and there would be trust, less wars. As simplistic as this may sound, I think I would have loved to live in a world without clothes. Thank you.
Hello everyone, I am Dua Al Jabri and I'm presenting for you a short brief about the birth of agriculture and its impact on human disease and the social environment. Early humans were very successful hunters. However, the growing population needed more stable food supply, so they began farming. The agriculture revolution, which occurred between 12,000 and 8,000 years ago, was the wide-scale transition of many human cultures from a lifestyle of hunting and gathering to one of agriculture and settlement, allowing the ability to support an increasing large population. Additionally, humans began domesticating animals to maintain protein-rich meats in their diet and eventually to help them farm or for transportation. Farming and the domestication of animals resulted in the concentration of humans into small geographic locations, living in close quarters with people and animals. This led disease to spread more rapidly than it had during the time in which hunter-gatherer societies existed, as inadequate sanitary practices and the domestication of animals allowed microbes to transfer from the animal to the human population, including measles, TB, and smallpox from cattle, influenza from pigs and ducks, and malaria from birds and chickens. Groups of people who had not lived in proximity with other large mammals, such as the Australian Aborigines and American indigenous people, were more vulnerable to infection and largely wiped out by diseases. According to the population history of American indigenous people, 90% of the population of certain regions in North and South America were wiped out. Findings by archaeologists and paleopathologists showed that nutritional standards of agriculture populations were generally inferior to that of hunters-gatherers, and that their life expectancy may well have been shorter too. In part, due to diseases and harder work, hunter-gatherers must have covered their food needs with about 20 hours work a week, while agriculture required much more and was at least as uncertain. The hunter-gatherer's diet was more varied and balanced than what agriculture later allowed. Average height went down from 5'10" feet to 5'5" for men, and 5'6" to 5'1" for women. It took until the 20th century for average human height to come back to the pre-agriculture revolution levels. Agriculturists had more anemias and vitamin deficiencies, more spinal deformations, and more dental pathologies. From the social point of view, recent analyses point out that settled agricultural life also brought about deep social divisions and, in particular, encouraged inequality. Before, all members of a tribe had to hunt together and share the results. Since there was no private property or anything to fight over, hunting and gathering societies were relatively peaceful and harmonious. In contrast, agriculture allowed individual families to farm their own lands. As a result, private property evolved, which led to social classes and more conflict in society between rich and poor. Finally, I'd like to end with this question. Would we be better off or worse off if agriculture was not discovered? What if early humans shifted to another source of food other than agriculture? The sea, for example. Would microparasite and social hierarchy find its way to us anyway?
Animals, friend or enemy? Hello, my name is Karen Herman. Today we will review the impact of animal herds on the human population. Domesticated and wild animal herds introduced infectious diseases to settlers. The travelers traded the uncertainty of the hunt for more secured settlements and food supplies. However, this trade came with severe and often dire consequences. People migrated to new parts of the world, and the travelers sought a location to settle. In these settlements, the people were introduced to new animals. Some of the animals were domesticated for reliable food sources like poultry, pigs, and cows, or for other uses like companionship, such as dogs, or labor, such as horses, donkey, and oxen. As for the wild animals like monkeys, bats, and rodents, the amount of human interaction varied, but occurred when humans encroached on the animals' habitat when expanding land and exploring. As settlements grew, human and animal interaction could not be avoided. In some settlements, human expansion permanently disrupted nature. Unknown to the settlers, domesticated and wild animal herds introduced infectious diseases. As you know, diseases caused by parasites, bacteria, and viruses naturally occur, and society had no initial protection from these diseases. The domestication of animals for a reliable source of food and the establishment of permanent settlements both came at the price of illness and death to the settlers in the form of infectious diseases. These diseases can cause a range of symptoms from mild illness to death. The disease may be mild in the animal population, but causes severe symptoms in humans. Let us look at a domesticated animal, the pig, and the H1N1 virus. The world was on edge with fear due to the 2009 H1N1 outbreak. Everyone thought the 2009 outbreak was going to be another pandemic, like the 1918 Spanish flu outbreak that caused an estimated 50 million deaths worldwide. Now, to a wild animal example. Let's take the fruit bat and the Ebola virus. The Ebola virus has a very high mortality rate, upwards of 90%. The current Ebola outbreak is ongoing with a mortality rate around 50%. These are just two examples of the infectious diseases associated with animal herds. We rely on animals for our survival and advancement. Consider how we use animals in modern food production. At what cost will we produce more chemically treated and hormone-enhanced meat? We may have created a breeding ground for more virulent infectious diseases like antibiotic-resistant salmonella. Now, consider how we use animals in modern science. What will we lose in our pursuit of a perfect drug tested and manufactured at the expense of thousands of animal experiments?
Hello, I am Dua Al-Jabri and I'll talk today about the bubonic plague, which is also famous by the Black Death. The term bubonic plague is derived from a Greek word that means swollen lymph nodes. It is usually resulting from the bite of an infected flea with Yersinia pestis bacteria, which aggregate in the gut of infected fleas and result in the flea regurgitating ingested blood, which is now infected, into the bite site of a rodent, such as rats and mice, who spreads the bacteria and seek out other prey when their redundant hosts die. Once established, bacteria rapidly spread to the lymph nodes and multiply. As the disease progresses, the lymph nodes can hemorrhage and become swollen and necrotic. Bubonic plague was documented in 3 great outbreak waves. The first outbreak of the bubonic plague was recorded in the Byzantine Empire during the 6th century and was named the Plague of Justinian after Emperor Justinian I, who was infected but survived through extensive treatment. The epidemic is estimated to have killed 50 million people in the Roman Empire alone, because the infectious disease spread inland by the transferring of the merchandise through Justinian's efforts in acquiring luxurious goods of the time and exporting supplies. His capital became the leading exporter of the bubonic plague. The second outbreak was in the late Middle Ages, around the 1340s, where the disease may have traveled along the Silk Road with the Mongol armies and traders. It was first introduced to Europe at the trading city of Kaffa in the Crimea in the 1347, then reached southern port cities in Italy, and thereafter steadily spread northward, killing millions in its path. Arab historians Ibn al-Wardani and al-Makrizi believed that Black Death originated in Mongolia, and this was proven correct as Chinese records showed a huge outbreak in Mongolia in the early 1330s. The Black Death emptied entire villages of people and created mass hysteria. The death toll was so great that a very religious continent thought that God was punishing man for sin. When it finally reached England in 1347, it wound up destroying more than a third of the population of the country, and from that time on, the disease would occur again and again all over Europe until the end of the 18th century. Because the plague killed so many of the working population, wages rose with the demand for labor. Some historians have seen this as a turning point in the European economic development. The third plague pandemic started in China in the middle of the 19th century, spreading to all inhabited continents and killing 10 million people in India alone. 12 plague outbreaks in Australia in 1900 to 1925 resulted in over 1,000 deaths. This led to the establishment of a public health department there, which undertook some leading-edge research on plague transmission from rat fleas to humans via the Yersinia pestis. Finally, here's a question for discussion. Can the plague be used as a bacteriological weapon? Will the modern bombs be fleas carrying out the bubonic plague? Are we ready for a biological weapon threat?
Hello, I'm Nora Al-Sharif, and I'll briefly be talking about the preparedness of the world's largest annual pilgrimage, Hajj, by the Saudi Arabia government. Between 2 and 3 million pilgrims from more than 183 countries make Hajj each year to Mecca in Saudi Arabia, which is a religious pilgrimage that every Muslim should undertake at least once in his lifetime. This represents an enormous organizational challenge in all aspects, especially the provision of healthcare within the Ministry of Health. Religious events and festivals can be attended by large numbers of pilgrims from within and outside the host country. One of the main public health concerns in relation to mass gatherings is the importation or exportation of infectious disease and spread between attendees and to the local population. The gathering of huge numbers of pilgrims can compromise the health system of the host countries. Moreover, the threat to global health security presented by infectious disease that might be exported to the pilgrim's home country shows the significance of advanced planning, global communication, public health surveillance, and response at religious mass gatherings. The Saudi government has a well-established system for the planning and administrative issues in relation to the Hajj. To minimize the health risk to the pilgrims, the Saudi Ministry of Health liaises with governments of all countries from which pilgrims visit Mecca. The public health measures for Hajj are focused on provision of safe water and food supplies, sanitation, vector control, pre-travel health regulation and advice about vaccinations, health checks, and specific immunization at the port of entry, health education campaigns, and provision of free health care to pilgrims through several clinics and hospitals. A proactive public health program is initiated before each Hajj, with focus on prevention of health hazards and healthcare provision during the pilgrimage. A multidisciplinary group of experts from various government sectors are involved in the advanced planning of health services, logistical support, and communication for the Hajj, along with continuous monitoring of emerging infectious disease. For instance, working together to control the Middle East respiratory syndrome coronavirus infection to not be transmitted to other pilgrims and avoid a worldwide epidemic. During Hajj, gastrointestinal infections are a major health hazard. Therefore, public health measures at the Hajj are focused on provision of safe water and food supplies, sanitation, and vector control. A Committee for Water Security Control does a daily inspection of the quality of drinking water to ensure that the chlorine pumping equipment function properly. Inspection of all main water supply sources and water tanks at various locations, including government departments and food stores in Mecca and the other holy sites, are done throughout the year. Furthermore, due to the warm, moist environment in Saudi Arabia, It is vulnerable to mosquitoes that are vectors for transmission of arboviruses and malaria. Therefore, a widespread vector control program is in action with routine and widespread pesticide spraying campaigns along the year. In Hajj, this program is intensified, and the Ministry of Health liaises closely with the Ministry of Public Health and Ministry of Agriculture to coordinate and assess pest control, identify the zones and density of mosquitoes, and undertake spraying campaigns. Specific teams spray housing units earmarked for pilgrims who come from dengue endemic areas such as India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, with long-lasting pesticide before the arrival of the pilgrims. The teams also spray government departments and all field accommodation used by pilgrims, such as tents at holy sites, with a long-lasting pesticide. In accordance with the international health regulations, all aircraft and ship carriers are required to provide an official valid carrier sanitation certificate to verify the insecticide spraying was done before arrival at the port. These are only few examples of the huge efforts done by the Saudi governments and public health departments before, during, and after Hajj. Finally, here's a question for discussion. Have you heard about any epidemic that spread in a religious gathering? Do you think it's the public health efforts or it's something beyond that? Hello, I'm Nora Sharif. Today I will be talking about a deadly virus that is spreading at record speed through Saudi Arabia. A novel coronavirus that had not previously been seen in humans was identified for the first time in a residence of the Middle East. The virus now known as the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus. The virus appears to be circulating widely throughout the Arabian Peninsula. All recent cases that have been reported outside the Middle East first developed infection in the Middle East. Then the cases were exported outside the region. A typical case of MERS consists of fever, cough, and shortness of breath. Pneumonia is a common finding on examination. Gastrointestinal symptoms, including diarrhea, have also been reported. Severe illness can cause respiratory failure that requires mechanical ventilation and support in an intensive care unit. More than half of infected patients have died, but many have also been in previous good health. The full picture on the source is not yet clear. Strains of MERS coronavirus that match human strains have been isolated from camels. Human and camel genetic sequence data demonstrate a close link between the virus found in camels and that found in people. Other animals, including goats, cows, sheep, and birds, have been tested for antibodies to MERS coronavirus, but so far none have been found in these animals. Camels play an important role for Bedouin people in Saudi Arabia as well as in other Gulf countries. Camels are renowned for their meat, milk, and even urine, which is said to have medicinal properties. When Saudi authorities have warned camel herders to be wary of their animals, which they believe transmit the disease, many people remained unconvinced and protested against a statement by the health minister who had expressed the belief that the virus could be transmitted via camels. Finally, my question is, although Saudi scientists have published warnings about risk of camels playing as a vector in the transmission of disease, camel herders in rural areas are still not taking these warnings seriously, as they consider them as pets and wealth. How do you think we can reach low-income and low-educated people to take precaution or give up his sick animals in order not to spread the disease?
Hi everyone, this is Christina Hill again. This HISPM 711 Power of 3 video will focus on John Snow and his impact on the field of public health. Snow was a physician who practiced in London from the late 1830s until his death of a stroke at the age of 45. He was a pioneer in the field of anesthesia, but he is most famous for his work in identifying the source of a cholera outbreak in 1854, thus determining that cholera is a waterborne disease. London in the 1850s was the largest city on the planet, and in fact it was the largest city in history up to that point in terms of population. It was also a highly unsanitary place to live. Livestock were often kept in homes, and sewage management systems often consisted of open cesspools in the basement. Outbreaks of disease were quite common, and cholera was one of the most deadly. Every few years, it would kill several thousand people in the course of a few days. Experts in the then fledgling field of public health became convinced that bad airs, called miasmas, were the source and carrier of cholera. the city administration passed the Nuisance Removal Act of 1848, mandating that citizens empty out their cesspools and dispose of their waste in the river to eliminate these bad airs. Unfortunately, this measure increased cholera incidence, as it is a waterborne disease, rather than decreasing it. John Snow was a practicing physician at the time of a particularly virulent outbreak in a neighborhood near Broad Street in 1854. One sick child's waste had been dumped into a cesspool that was near to the Broad Street pump and was leaking into the well water. Snow had argued for some time that cholera was waterborne rather than airborne, but had not convinced the medical community. He teamed up with a minister named Henry Whitehead and determined through door-to-door interviews that households stricken by cholera all shared in common the Broad Street pump as their source of drinking water. Snow created a map to document the number of deaths at each residence, demonstrating visually the source of the outbreak at the pump. When Snow presented his information to the parish officials, the handle of the pump was removed to keep people from obtaining water at that source. This halted the outbreak and prevented further cholera infection from that pump. Unfortunately, after the outbreak subsided, the officials replaced the handle of the pump and rejected Snow's conclusions, sticking to their theory of airborne cholera. However, Snow's ideas were disseminated and slowly began to make an impact on public health practices. The last really debilitating outbreak of cholera in London was in 1866, according to Stephen Johnson. City officials responded to the outbreak by telling everyone to boil their water, and the outbreak ceased. John Snow had by that time been deceased almost a decade, but the world looks back on his work as the first real touchstone of epidemiological research. It may be hard to imagine today, when the majority of the world's population lives in large cities, but Snow helped to chisel away at the idea that growth of cities the size of London was unsustainable. Perhaps most importantly, he demonstrated that humans can solve seemingly unsurmountable public health problems through reason and logic. The article by Koch and Denicky assigned for today's class reading argues that Snow could have been more convincing to his critics, and that his theory of waterborne infection of cholera would have been accepted earlier had he used a comparison of the relative risk ratios or mortality per 1,000 persons in the Broad Street area versus other nearby areas, rather than relying on the crude rates he used in his map. Do you agree with the authors? If so, why or why not? Thank you for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed today's class discussion.
This Power of Three video by Emily Zimmerman is on the evolution of medicine through the contributions of three 19th century scientists, Louis Pasteur, Robert Koch, and Joseph Lister. The impact of their findings and innovations propelled medicine into a new era of life-saving techniques. This video will explore the history of science, medicine, and modern thought that created the foundations for these dramatic contributions, as well as the implications of their work. Before the mid-19th century, medical care was a rather hit-or-miss affair. Some medical practices helped patients, while some were downright harmful. Why? Medical science lacked an adequate theory of infectious disease, which was no trivial matter, as infectious diseases were the primary cause of mortality. There were several competing theories. Miasma theory held that disease was caused by a poisonous vapor with suspended particles of decaying matter characterized by a foul smell. Although this theory may have contributed to well-being by promoting new sanitary measures, it did not create a useful therapeutic approach for medicine. Contagion theory recognized the spread of disease through seeds, more akin to inert chemicals than microorganisms. Of course, concepts of morality and divine intervention remained important interpretations of disease, but overall a naturalistic approach to disease and treatment predominated in medicine in the 19th century. In addition to naturalistic ideas about health and disease, tools for investigating the human and natural environment were a necessary precursor to advancement. As the stethoscope allowed for a view of physiological functioning from the inside, starting in 1816, the microscope was a necessary precursor to germ theory. But McNeill states that in the 1880s, the microscope abruptly reversed the balance of medical opinion. In fact, a relatively powerful microscope was invented in the Netherlands in the 17th century. making possible the observation of microorganisms by about 1700. Bacteria were even observed in the blood of infected animals years before Pasteur's experiments, but they were thought to be the result of disease rather than the cause. The leap forward that capitalized on naturalistic theories of disease and new methods of empirical observation and analysis was dependent upon careful experimentation. In the mid-19th century, Louis Pasteur, a French chemist, went beyond observation to hypothesize that microbes caused spoilage in wine, beer, and milk, conducted groundbreaking experiments, and developed pasteurization to kill microorganisms. Pasteur disproved the theory of spontaneous generation and linked microbes to the development of disease. Soon after, Dr. Robert Koch built on the work of Pasteur and identified the microbes responsible for TB and cholera. He developed Koch's postulates for linking particular microbes to particular diseases. The new germ theory of disease led to a revolution in medicine, including vaccinations and the introduction of antiseptic surgery by English surgeon Joseph Lister, opening the way for safer surgery and the development of a new arsenal of surgical techniques. These innovations, based in rational inquiry and empirical evidence, provided a new basis for medical authority and competence to help bring medicine and its practice into a new era. Pasteur, Koch, and Lister were all European. What characteristics of European science and medicine created conditions for experimentation that were not as prevalent in America at the time?
Hello everyone, I am Doal Jabri and I'll talk to you today about the significant work of Goldberger and Seidenstreicher in the field of public health. Goldberger, a physician and epidemiologist, and Seidenstreicher, a public health statistician and economist, were pioneer scientists who have significant contribution to the development of social epidemiology. They were also advocates for scientific and social recognition of the links between poverty and disease. Their work together started in 1914 when they were assigned to an investigation of pellagra in the south of the United States. Between 1900 and 1940, the pellagra killed at least 100,000 individuals. Goldberger's theory that pellagra was associated with diet and poverty contradicted the commonly held opinion that pellagra was an infectious disease. Although half of these pellagra victims were African American and more than 2/3 were women, contemporary observers paid little attention to these gender and racial differences in their analysis of disease. Goldberger and Seidenstreicher were the first to detect social determinants and link between health, poverty, and diet. They argued that pellagra was deeply rooted in the political economy of cotton monoculture in the South, especially that the dramatic drop in cotton prices in 1920 and decrease in the income of many Southerners caused a spike in the number of reported pellagra cases. They also found a significant correlation between the rise and fall in the price of animal protein foods and the disease's onset and remission. To prove this hypothesis, Goldberger tried to prevent and cure the disease with a dietary intervention in 2 orphanages that have high rates of endemic pellagra. He kept the sanitary conditions unchanged during the study to exclude bias and arranged for 2 groups of ill and healthy children to receive a new, more varied diet. Results showed no new cases of pellagra occurred and almost all children with pellagra were cured. Goldberger then repeated the study in a mental asylum, using both a treatment and a control group followed up for 1 year. Of 72 patients with pellagra, all were cured after the introduction of the new diet. Critics were still hassling Goldberger that pellagra was an infectious disease, not a dietary disorder, which made him angry and frustrated. He hoped that one final dramatic experiment would convince his critics. On April 1916, he injected 5 cubic centimeters of a pelagran blood into the arm of his assistant, Dr. George Wheeler. Wheeler shot 6 centimeters of such blood into Goldberger. Then they swabbed out the secretions of a pelagran's nose and throat and rubbed them into their own noses and throats. They swallowed capsules containing scabs of Pelegrin's rashes. Others joined what Goldberger called his filth parties, including his wife, and none of the volunteers got pellagra. Despite Goldberger's heroic efforts, few physicians remained staunch opponents of the dietary theory. For Goldberger's final work, he abandoned the epidemiologic method, believing that it had confirmed his original hypothesis and had reached the limits of its own potential. Goldberger and his colleagues moved from community observation to clinical experiment, producing excellent examples of both public health research and clinical investigation. The most striking aspect of Goldberger and Seidenstreicher work was its flexibility and sensitivity to social and economic contexts. Seidenstreicher introduced a systematic way of thinking about diseases, their social distribution, and the methods to study them, and the implications for health policy. He pioneered rigorous survey methods not only in the United States, but subsequently for the League of Nations. Goldberger, in himself and in his career, personifies the emergence of epidemiology as a discipline built on its own logic from data founded on observation, experiment, and evidence-based action at the population level. In the scale and complexity of Goldberger's and Seidenstreicher's work, in their dependence on team techniques and interdisciplinary studies, they were forerunners of a new idiom in the social approach to disease, and built the roots of social and clinical epidemiology in the 20th century. Finally, here's a question for discussion. How do you think social determinants in health have shaped our today's research? Do you think that improving the social determinants of the countries in Rosling bottom left corner will significantly improve their situation?
Hi, my name is Gloria Esoememe, and this is my Power of 3 video. My topic today is, when and why did medicine begin to make an impact on health? Prehistorically, people had various ways and customs that helped prevent and treat diseases. Some of these customs were effective, but were sometimes matched with contradictory practices that were harmful to man. The first records of medicine was of the Egyptian Imhotep in 2600 BC. He described the diagnosis and treatment of 200 diseases. Prominent in the history of medicine are Hippocrates and Galen because of their contribution to the development of medical science. Even though several advances were made in medicine, for example, the microscope was invented, medicine did not have a wide geographical impact on health. The impact of the profession remained negligible until the 18th century, and this started with the inoculation of smallpox virus. The practice was to inoculate the virus from a ripe pustule of some person who suffered from smallpox into a non-immune person. Inoculation with smallpox virus had varying degrees of success. Some people became immune, but others contracted the disease and died or became the source of a new epidemic. In 1788, the scientist Edward Jenner inoculated a healthy 8-year-old boy with cowpox, a disease caused by a virus that closely resembles the smallpox virus. Jenner's experiment was a success, and his patient failed to contract smallpox virus, even when deliberately exposed to the virus. In 1967, more than 2 centuries after Jenner's first experiment, the World Health Organization launched a global immunization campaign to wipe out smallpox. The efforts were remarkably effective, and the last naturally occurring case of smallpox was reported in Somalia in 1977. The global eradication of smallpox was verified in 1979 and endorsed by the World Health Assembly in 1980. In that year, smallpox vaccinations were discontinued worldwide. Just like smallpox, the World Health Organization initiated an effort to eradicate polio in 1988 and has reduced the number of annual diagnosed cases from the hundreds of thousands to 291 in 2012, a 99.9% reduction. However, polio remains endemic in a few countries: Afghanistan, Nigeria, and Pakistan. The main obstacles to global eradication of polio are insecurity, the lack of basic health infrastructure, which limits vaccine distribution and delivery, and the crippling effects of civil wars and internal strife. However, the most underlying factor contributing to the continued circulation of polio immunization programs has been opposition in some countries for religious and political reasons. This implies that prevention of diseases does not merely rest with medical science, but an interaction between science and sociology. So my question, how can we take advantage of sociology to improve the impact of public health? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jared Bullard, and my Power of 3 video is on the direction change of epidemiologic transition, McNeil's 3 Threats, Chapter 6 of Plagues and Peoples. The scientific field of medicine, along with the development of public health administrative practices and procedures, has paved the way of redefining the meaning of infectious disease. The advancement of society as knowledge and skill increased allowed for the practice and teaching of medicine to be deemed a field of science, thus leading to an array of erudite scholars and doctors such as Koch and Snow to research, discover, and determine the cause of infectious disease. Therefore, presently, mankind tend to believe that humans have won the battle over infectious diseases and epidemics, but McNeil points out that the developments of medical science has placed on the natural ecological relationships have potential adverse side effects. First, McNeil points out the appearance of diseases of cleanliness, with the example of the occurrence of poliomyelitis, short-term polio, in the most meticulous and clean classes of society. Those who contracted the poliovirus later in life because of maintaining a sanitary regimen or routine most often were severely paralyzed or died from the viral infection. This idea of cleanliness-associated diseases was first proposed by epidemiologist David Strachan in 1989 when he discovered that children who grew up with siblings were less likely to suffer from allergies and eczema, most likely because a larger family meant more germs. This proposal was termed the hygiene hypothesis. Other studies have been conducted to show that the hygiene hypothesis may also be applied to diabetes, hay fever, autism, and multiple sclerosis, with the intention that hygiene may be a potential risk factor. But don't panic. Please continue to practice healthy sanitation procedures such as washing your hands to prevent the spread of germs. But scientists say that our immune system needs germs in order to differentiate which germs are our friends and which ones are our enemies. Early exposure to germs allow for our bodies to develop this necessary trait to keep our bodies healthy and not develop an overly sensitive immune system. The second threat proposed by McNeil is that microparasites may undergo a mutation, empowering it with the ability to become resistant to antibodies and vaccines. One such example illustrated by McNeil is the influenza virus, or more commonly referred to as the flu. The influenza outbreak in 1918, called the Spanish flu, led to a worldwide estimated total of 50 million deaths. And in 1957, a new flu virus emerged in the Far East. In the summer of 57, this new strain of flu made its way to the States. This brought about 69,800 deaths. And yet again in 1968, another new strain of flu emerged in Hong Kong, referred to as the Hong Kong flu. This led to the death of 33,000 people. And most recently, in the spring of 2009, the H1N1 swine flu arose in the U.S. and quickly spread among the American population. The U.S. government declared the H1N1 flu virus a public health emergency on April 26, 2009, and by June, 18,000 cases of H1N1 had been reported in the U.S. So McNeil was correct in his observation. Viruses have the ability to mutate. The flu is one of the best examples. And as society progresses, we will continue to suffer from the flu and any other potential virus that can mutate and continually provoke mankind, challenging our medical, technology, and intellectual ability to cope and prevail over microparasitism. The third and final threat suggested by McNeil is the idea of biological warfare or bioterrorism. This idea is not new. In fact, its roots can be dated back to 300 BC, where the Persians, Greeks, and Romans utilized the carcass of dead animals to contaminate water sources such as wells of their enemies. Other examples of biological warfare can be identified in World War I, where the Germans developed anthrax, glanders, and cholera and a wheat fungus to use as bioweapons. And during World War II, the Japanese operated a secret biowarfare research facility in Manchuria. Experiments were conducted on human prisoners, More than 3,000 victims were exposed to anthrax, syphilis, and many others. The U.S. formed the War Research Service, where they researched the use of anthrax and botulinum toxin as weapons in the 40s. This research continued into the 1950s and 60s. So once again, McNeil was on point that the side effects of knowledge growth, technology, and medical research can potentially allow infectious diseases to once again dominate. We cannot underestimate the intelligence of microparasites. We humans think that we are the dominant species, but let's not get carried away. These threats could come to pass, and as the saying goes, history repeats itself. So I would like to leave you guys with a discussion question. How can we begin to prepare to tackle these possible threats if they tend to emerge in the future? Thank you.